For those of you who have already joined us, we are so excited to have you here this afternoon and excited that we have these two amazing experts with us. We will take a minute or two just to wait for some other folks to be able to join us. Many people are rushing out of classrooms and trying to get on the webinar. So we'll give it a few minutes. In the meantime, there should be in the chat link a form that you can just say that you're here. You can sign in, and we will use that form to raffle off some treats at the end. So please do let us know that you're here. Also, if you are here with us at this moment and you've already been able to join, if you will just put in the comments if you have a couple of barriers that you are experiencing in bringing the science of reading into your classroom, into your school, into your district, into your state, into your charter network, if you just bullet out a few big challenges, that will help us as we share information to get some more information to you and make sure we're addressing your specific concerns. So fire away in that comment section. All right, we will get started. I am really delighted to have Dr. Nicole Mancini with us today and Nikki Bridges. I have had the great fortune of knowing Nikki for a number of years and the good fortune of getting to know Dr. Mancini over the past year and a half. And both of them are incredible leaders in our national effort to transform our schools and bring them into science of reading and best practice. And I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then I'll probably tell you a few more reasons why I love them so much. All right, Nicole, you're first.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Mancini. I'm currently the Chief of Academics for the Council of the Great City Schools. I'm formerly the Chief Academic Officer for Broward County Public Schools, which is the 6th largest district in the nation. A lot of my work revolved in Broward around shifting the district to a mindset around the science of reading. That work continues despite me being with the council, which is probably my greatest legacy, is that the work that I put in place is continuing. And now I get to do what I love to do with 78 of the nation's largest urban districts across this nation. So thank you for having me today, and I look forward to having a wonderful conversation with Jackie and Nikki.
Nikki?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki Bridges. I am the founder and CEO of LIT, which is a nonprofit that partners with school systems across the country on evaluating and redesigning and implementing the science of reading across their systems. Prior to LIT, I was an elementary school teacher, principal, a regional superintendent, and also a chief executive officer of a school turnaround venture. And I'm just really delighted to be here today with everyone so we can dig in and talk more about the science of reading.
So I would like to ask both of you to open with responding to a comment we hear often. Reading opens the doors to the world. Why are you both so passionate about the science of reading approach? And what first inspired you to move into this effort and be so committed to this approach? Nikki?
Yeah. I think reading has been something that I've been obsessed with for the last 24 years. And I've always wanted to get right as an educator. And I think the day that I learned that 95% of children are cognitively capable of learning to read, that is when I knew that the work of fixing our literacy problem in this nation was true liberatory work and work that I wanted to make sure I dedicated my life to. Because when you know that 95% of children regardless of background, are capable of learning to read. That makes our current literacy proficiency data seem mind-blowing, right? Like, there is no reason why it looks the way that it looks. It's something that fuels me. And while I often hear people talk about, like, I'm dedicated to this because I'm passionate about reading, I'm actually angry when I look at the statistics. Like, I'm fueled by anger. Like, we know how to right this wrong. And specifically, at Lit, we work with systems that serve children who have been historically marginalized, children who look like me. And there is absolutely no reason why we are keeping from educators the tools that we know children need in order to be lifelong readers who will have agency and control over their lives. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm excited about conversations like these.
Nicole?
So I started as a speech language pathologist, and I am currently still a certified speech language pathologist today. And I have a love for language. Much of my training was in hospital settings, working with patients that had brain injuries, and my job was to help them learn how to read, write, speak, and listen again, pretty much rewiring the brain. And through that work, I learned a lot about how the brain functions and ways that we can get the brain to work differently in order to accomplish a lot of these things. When I transitioned into the school system, I did it with a passion and almost that angst that Nikki was talking about. That why does this problem still exist? We know how the brain works. We know how to get people to read and write. Why are we not doing this? And why are so many of our students struggling? So I set out on this mission to really make that difference in the sixth largest district in the nation, not realizing what a huge undertaking that was going to be. And it's one thing to know about all the research that it's probably 5 decades now, right? The research that's been out there that we know about, and then translating that into practice. And what I've learned over the past 25 years is we can read and we can know a lot, but if we aren't there to help assist those around us, all the way from our superintendents down to our teachers and our paraprofessionals, in terms of how we do this work and how we do it effectively to make those changes in instructional practices, then we're doing a disservice to the evidence and the research. So it's taking the evidence and the research, help translating that into practice, and supporting teachers along that journey to help make those statistics that we see today change tomorrow.
We are getting a question already and a couple questions in the comments saying, we're on board with the science of reading. We agree. But what do we do in the classroom? What does this look like in practice? How do we actually do this work so that students move? So I would love to ask each of you to give some of the high level work and then more specific work, or what are some of these instructional shifts that teachers need to learn, and what does it look like in practice? Nikki? I know that's a hard one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question. I think part of our focus at Lit is often we are asked, what should teachers be doing? And our response tends to be, before we talk about teachers, we need to talk about what the system is doing, what leaders are doing, what leaders are clearing paths, and how they're creating the conditions in which teachers and children can thrive. I think often, we want quick fixes, like, what can I do tomorrow that will change everything? And unfortunately, while we have a ton of research and we have a lot of things that we know can work, we also have to be really thoughtful about the conditions in which we're putting certain practices in place. And so we are always going and looking holistically, not just at what are teachers doing, but what are the system level leaders doing? What are the building level leaders doing to support change? And often we are providing or asking for a go slow to go fast approach, and ensuring that we are supporting system level leaders and building level leaders with making changes slowly over time, learning from those changes, and then supporting teachers and learning and adopting more practices along the way. Because it's more than just changing curriculum. It's more than just changing your assessment. We're often asking people to do an entire overhaul of their mindsets, of their beliefs, of their practices. And that's not going to be solved by going into a classroom and saying, just do X. Because I know we all deeply believe teachers are the key change agent to children's lives in the classroom. And I've never met a teacher who doesn't want the best for their children. And so we shouldn't put the burden just on teachers to adopt new things as much as ask systems to reimagine and shift their entire way of thinking and being and doing about reading. And that is going to then in turn allow teachers to thrive and adopt new practices over time. So I know that's like a really high level response. That's not necessarily do these 3 things tomorrow, but it is something that at Lit we deeply believe in order to make change.
Nikki, just for a minute, I'm going to dig a little into this. You talked about, we could adopt the right curriculum, and hopefully more and more districts will move to adopt curriculums that are validated and aligned to the science of reading and what we know. And we sadly know that over 60% of our school districts are still using curriculum that is not aligned and is not proven to be effective. But let's say the district and the system does the right thing and the curriculum is now being introduced. What does the teacher practice shift look like? So what were they doing before when they had maybe a balanced literacy curriculum, and now they have this new curriculum? What is their day-to-day practice going to look like? And how do they even start on this journey? Is they ready themselves to change how they work with students in their classroom?
I can't remember the exact report, but there was a research study about what happens in schools when new curriculum and assessment is adopted. And the findings from the report showed that there is a very low percentage of principals who support teachers and becoming expert in the new curriculum, and not just the curriculum, but the instructional practices the curriculum might be asking a teacher to implement. So it's not that so when I think about that, I go to what is the principal doing to support teachers in their practice? What might shift? And so if we're asking teachers to shift, for example, from a leveled literacy model to investing in decodable readers, for example, as being a key lever in supporting an early reader, then we need to make sure that building level leaders have an understanding of those instructional practices and the why behind why we're making this move, and then can be collaborators, co-teachers, observers in classrooms, not there to evaluate a teacher, but support a teacher in building the muscles to be able to execute this new approach of using decodable readers, for example, in the classroom. And how are we as building leaders, as system level leaders, creating communities of learning where we're observing, we're watching video of each other, we are sharing what is working, what is not working, and problem solving together, so that, again, we're all building muscle around new shifts that we're making. We have found that it's really helpful for teachers as a community to have really clear guidelines in terms of these are the 1 to 2 things we want to become really good at. And we're going to be obsessed with those 1 or 2 things. And there are 100 other things we want to tackle. And those things are important, but these are the 2 things. And so maybe those 2 things are, we want to get really great at teaching all of the sounds correctly and ensuring that children are then able to blend them. And that's the thing we're going to be obsessed about for this year. And we're going to track our progress. And then you can see a positive snowball effect in terms of teacher practice getting stronger. And we would argue when teacher practice is getting stronger, we'd also want to see building level leader practice and coaching getting stronger, system level leader practice and coaching getting stronger, because the system isn't just the health of the classroom, it's the health of the entire building, it's the health of the entire system.
Yeah, if I could build on what Nikki has said, especially about the time, it took us 6 years to get to where we were when I left. The first stage was readying the central office and changing their mindset around what good instructional practices about related to reading and writing instruction in the classroom look like. And then how, as a central office staff member or support member and a principal or a literacy coach, then helps support that. We went from central office to the literacy coaches that were school based, that were going to be the primary levels of support. And then we pulled in our central office and school based administrators together. It's important to know that this doesn't happen overnight. What we are seeing in Mississippi and Tennessee did not happen in a year. They will tell you there were years and years and years of work that went into readying the system for this massive shift that's going to take place. And then essentially what we realized was we were re-educating all of our educators, because they had come from, and in the district I came from, over 52% did not come from an educational program. So less teachers came from an educational program than teachers who did. Those teachers were actually easier to help make that shift than those who did go through an educational program. But what we also had to realize and recognize and understand and have patience with was that teachers had been doing things for a good 25 years, thinking that they were doing the right thing. And it's not that they didn't know any better. If they're coming to these aha moments. And we saw with our own eyes these aha moments happening, where coaches and teachers started questioning themselves and the materials. But if this is what the research and evidence says, then why are we doing this? And they themselves came to that conclusion. And then they started helping each other help make those shifts through communities of practice. You have to look at each level of the system within the entire district. And if everyone's not on board, that's the first thing you need to do, is make sure everyone's on board, so that no matter where children go or where teachers transfer to, they're going to get the right instruction built on evidence and research that we know works. The professional learning is very deep and intensive. And trying to change what someone's been doing for 25 years is very hard. But you need to have ambassadors or people who really do know what they're doing within your district to be able to support those teachers. And like Nikki mentioned, if a principal goes into a classroom, there's a lot of things they need to take into account. And it's not what they were doing in a classroom 25 years ago. It's what should be happening now. So it's ongoing cyclical work that is constantly in flow. And the more we learn, the more we share, the more we practice, the more we give feedback, the better we get. So that time piece is very important, because a lot of times there's a lot of pressure from the state, from our school boards, etc., that they want results overnight, and they don't happen overnight. Our children are not nuts and bolts. They're
We
human beings, and so are our teachers. So it takes time for learning on both ends to happen.
we have a question, which is a great question, and I hear teachers ask this a lot. So I'm glad Andrea brought it up. okay, so our principal's on board with science of reading, at least they say they are, and yet our curriculum is still balanced literacy. What do I do? How I mean,
So
there's so as we said,
It,
over 60% of the districts are still using balanced literacy, so we have a lot of teachers who now are seeing the research and really wanna change. What do they do in that context, in that environment?
well, that's part of readying the system. So let's try and differentiate between curriculum and instructional materials because there is a difference. So we adopt instructional materials, they become part of our curriculum. And part of that curriculum aligns with the evidence and the research. There has yet to be something out there that fits every single check on that list. There is nothing. What our central office and our curriculum experts need to do is to make sure that they understand where those gaps are in the instruction materials that they're adopting and be able to provide the fillers in the curriculum so the teachers know how to seamlessly transition with their instruction materials and strengthen those pieces that we know are weak within the materials that districts are adopting. In many cases and in many states, there is a list, and the districts have to choose from the list. And if some of the better things are not on the list, they're put in very difficult positions. Um, I've experienced that, and there are ways to get around that to still be in compliance with state statute, but also do what's right for kids. But you need to have really strong leaders that are willing to do that in those districts.
If teachers and Nikki, maybe you can help think about this a bit too. So if teachers are appreciating that this change is gonna take a while and they understand that, and we all know that things work better when it starts with the system and it comes down and everyone is aligned, but we've got teachers that are still wanting to do what's right for their kids. They still really wanna move their students, and they don't have the instructional materials, they don't have the curriculum, they don't have the system readiness. Are there things that they can do to still try to help move their students? Nikki, what do you think?
yeah, I mean, it it's definitely feeling like you're putting a square peg in a round hole. And I like listening to Dr. Mancini. I'm like, yes, this is why lit we work with system level leaders, because again, we're putting so much burden on a teacher to be the agent of change when there's so much sitting on top of them that is blocking. But if I think about what are some things that perhaps uh, school level folks could do, including classroom teachers, if you have a principal or administrator who is invested in learning more about the science of reading and starting to bring in elements, for example, perhaps they're doing professional learning. Um, there is an opportunity to say, as a community of learners, as a community of educators, let's start to map out some of the things that we are learning from the research. And like Dr. Mancini said, you often will see a groundswell of like, hey, research says X, but like our curriculum that we're using is saying Y. That's curious. Like we should interrogate that more. So it's one, starting to have those conversations. I think two, it's finding really small ways where you can start to bring in what you are learning into the classroom. So I keep going back to decodable readers because I feel like that is a really common entry point. So it's like, if we still have to do leveled reading because that is mandated, let's take out the leveled readers. Let's put in decodable readers instead. Let's download the University of Oregon's Dibbles assessment and look at what does Dibbles say an end of year kindergartner, beginning of year first grader should be able to do. Let's analyze those subtests together. Let's then figure out when in our day can we begin to teach those skills? What can we leverage in our instructional materials that might allow us to insert things like segmenting, blending? When could we do some phonological awareness activities? Like, what are the small things we could begin to weave in? But I think that if a school community is invested in making these shifts, the brain power of the group is going to be stronger than the individual. So it's like, find your people. If it's not the whole school, find the 3, 5 educators in the building who are like, let's get creative together and start to dig into where we can start to pull certain elements into our day while still complying to the current reading model.
Nikki, you did such a beautiful job of giving, for lack of a better phrase, some tips. I know they're not tips, they're really critical instructional practices and helping children move through critical milestones. Can you go back and just slowly walk through some of that? So, one of the simple things a teacher can do, even if the curriculum is not yet where it needs to be, is start to bring in decodables, just to make sure everybody, I know there's a lot of parents on the call as well. What is a decodable and why do we want those in the classroom?
Right. So a decodable text is going to feature sound spelling patterns that are that follow rules. So I know that when I see the letter C, it says k. I see the letter T, it says t. Right. So we're putting together sounds, individual sounds that students, when they see them, could be able to sound out and then blend together into a word. And we're introducing readers that have sound or sound spelling patterns that have been taught that we know a child could be able to read either with some support or independently. And so we've worked, for example, in our very early years as an organization with a school where that was the very first thing that they did, was take out the leveled readers that relied on patterns or guessing at words, and they put in decodable readers because they were using a phonics program. So that is one potential step towards aligning to research. I don't know if you want me to go back to Dibbles.
That would be great too. So, just really quickly on the decodables, another reason why this is so important is it's matching what the child is learning. So, if the child is learning a set of sounds and letter combinations, but then they're reading a book that's disassociated from that and at various levels, it's not connected, it's very hard for them to take into practice and read what they're learning. And so that's why the decodable is so critical. Nicole, I don't know if you want to add anything else on that, but Nikki, we'll go back to you and have you talk a little bit like what is DIBBLES and in general, what kinds of assessments work well.
Yeah. So first of all, you want to make sure your decodables are following the sequence, your scope and sequence, because otherwise there's a disconnect there. And there are a plethora of free resources that have been vetted by well-known organizations as well as professional learning that people can partake in. So, there can't be that excuse that there's nothing out there. There are organizations they're curating vetted materials so that that work doesn't need to be done by teachers or schools or systems. And that needs to be taken advantage of. I know there were a lot of materials made available free during the pandemic. Some of those are still free to this day because people realize the importance of not making money, but helping children learn how to read the right way. And the same thing goes for assessments as well. If anyone's heard of CORE, there's a lot of free assessments that are quick and gives you good information. I always say, if it's taking you 2 hours to assess a child, we have a problem. You should be able to determine what's going on, how a child's learning how to read, and where those deficits are in a much easier and quicker way. Part of the problem we have is that teachers don't know that scope and sequence. They don't know what they're looking for, which is why the professional learning is so important. So none of this can really be done in isolation, but know that there are so many resources out there. But I also caution you where you get them from. because there's also a lot out there that we need to be really cautious about because they may not truly be aligned and they may just have it stamped it aligns to the science of reading. So we really need to know our research, our evidence, and make sure that we're using really good resources to do our work, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's supervising teachers, whether it's coaching teachers, or whether it's in educating your school board or your superintendent or others in the system, because they're they also jump on the bandwagon saying, "Oh, I heard this." Well, let me take some time and explain why that is not aligned, but why things like A, B, and C over here are aligned, and that is why we're choosing to do this instead of go and use that.
Nikki, you talked about blending, segmenting. Talk about some of those really critical skills that are part of that sequence of how a child begins to read. And then a teacher could go out and study more about those specific topics.
Um, I think that just like looking at some of the resources being shared in the comments, I do think, going back to what Dr. Mancini shared, it's important to find the resources that have been vetted, we know are aligned with research and have impact. So, for example, resources from UFly have been uh, dropped in the comments. That's an excellent program to go and study and research, putting it against other potentially free programs that are out in the market. I think for me, being really transparent, it's really hard for me to list a lot of band-aids for people to take. Like that's very antithetical to the work that Lit does. Like I keep going back to, I think it's really difficult to ask an individual teacher in an individual classroom to try to tape together elements of the science of reading. I think that's really hard. And so I think if you do have some sort of influence with your building level principal, for example, to try something like give us 9 weeks, let us try UFly, give us 9 weeks, let us try X, give us 9 weeks, like let's take the reading league's evaluation guidelines and put it up against our curriculum. Like, how can you begin to influence your building level leaders to begin to influence the system? Like, I do think it's really hard to make recommendations that I know from experience begin to erode or eat away at whatever momentum or passion that an individual educator in the classroom might have, because you always feel like you're bumping your head up against a brick wall. And so I guess I would shift to like, what are some of the things one might be able to do to begin to influence and motivate other stakeholders who have more power to begin to make those shifts? Like, what are the small things?
Quick wins. We call them quick wins.
Like,
Quick small wins that in the end get you further.
And of course, my dog decides he wants to give a comment on all this too. I think that's really important advice that Nikki is giving, and that it's really hard to chop this up into small bits and pieces. There are small things you can do that she's giving you, but the most powerful is really to influence the system and to influence at least your building level leader, which sometimes takes longer than any of us would want. You are both out there in the field trying to help the transition happen. You're trying to get adoption. Nicole, you're doing it now across a bunch of districts. Where are you seeing the resistance? Why do we still have 60% of our school districts doing what we know now doesn't really work? What are the biggest challenges? And you've been speaking about some ways to get influence and organize. What are some of the other challenges you're seeing, and what opportunities to change those or impact those do you see?
Um, I think that districts have given schools so much autonomy that now trying to rein that autonomy in, and then implement some type of managed autonomy, is a hard change in and of itself to make. Uh, Funding, so there was a lot of funding. What did districts decide to prioritize with that funding? And again, having the capacity to support the work, that's critical at all levels of the system, and it takes building the capacity of the people who are going to do that work. It takes time in and of itself. So what we're seeing is we're seeing the shift. We're seeing the teachers all say we need to be using the same thing. We all need to be on the same page. um, Helping everyone understand that it's not just about phonics and phonemic awareness and print concepts. You have to build vocabulary and content knowledge and background knowledge all at the same time. And together, all of that is what helps build that strong reader in the end. And it doesn't start in kindergarten. What we're encouraging our districts to do is really outstretch and reach into that community. The community that I grew up in and I worked in has 650 childcare centers. Where do all those students come for kindergarten? The majority come to the public school system. Well, if they're not doing what they need to be doing in the early ages from birth to 5, our kids are not coming in ready. We knew before the pandemic they weren't coming in ready. Now it's been amplified because they lack the experiences and opportunities that they could have had, but they didn't get due to the pandemic. So now we're seeing this bigger so-called cliff that, parents ask, what can I do? Talk to your child in the car, in the grocery store, everywhere you go. I do it with everyone else's children. They give their children to me. You go spend 6 hours with, Miss Nicole. And because I'm constantly talking not just to them, but with them. And there's conversations going on. We know children come to school that come from lower SES, social economic backgrounds, with this gap in terms of vocabulary. But really, what we're looking at is a lack of opportunity and experience to build that vocabulary. So, how are we creating those experiences, both in school, out of school, and with our community partners? We put our community partners through the science of reading professional learning. If our children are going to you after they've been with us for 6 hours, we want you reinforcing what we're teaching. So they were just hungry, eating it up, saying, if we just had this years ago, we could have been doing this all along. But it's there's a partnership there where it's not just the teacher, it's not just the principal, it's not just the school, it's not just the district, it's the entire community that comes together and says, this is a priority, and we are all willing to work in this direction because we realize how important all of this is. So, no matter what your background is, you're going to learn a little bit about this so everyone can support our children. Because, like Nikki, they're our children, and all of our children need to be successful, and all of our children need to be proficient readers and writers by the end of second grade. Third grade and on, it becomes so difficult. And that is also, those are also years between third grade and eighth grade that we need to devote more attention to, because we're seeing large deficits and teachers are struggling in terms of, what do I do with a sixth or seventh grader who still can't read and should have learned all this in first and second grade? So a lot of times we tend to talk about the early years, but I don't want to forget about the adolescent stages. And I don't want us to also leave out that there's more than just phonics and phonemic awareness. There's just all those other pieces on the other side that are critical to being that proficient reader in the end.
Nikki, Nicole is talking about, bringing in this background knowledge and vocabulary, and I think there's been a little bit of a debate lately of, "Oh, should we just do phonics and wait till all the mechanics are in place and children can read, and then we teach the background knowledge?" And I see you both shaking your heads. Um, talk about this tension that has emerged, which is really inappropriate. It's not a or, it's an and. And can you talk about how these two come together? So how do we think about background knowledge and vocabulary and teaching the foundations of reading together?
Yeah, I think it's a false dichotomy that is meant to poke holes in the movement for research informed reading instruction. It's just a false binary. I think when we understand all the components that go into being a fluent reader, we realize that there are so many strands, right? If we're familiar with Scarpa's reading rope, we know we cannot be a proficient, fluent reader if we just have language comprehension or we just have word recognition. That's not true. All the strands are being built simultaneously. And so I do think it's a false dichotomy, and when I think about some of the challenges facing school systems, one thing that we see in our work is there's always the ask for the silver bullet. What's the thing that will just fix word recognition, phonics gap? Well, just give me the fix, or just tell me how to fix my 6th grade reading comprehension results. And we want the patch, we want the silver bullet, versus getting to the real root of the problem and asking ourselves, how can we systematically begin to heal our system to get to health? What is it going to take to move the system to at the very least 80% of children year over year being proficient readers? Like, that is a long path. And in education, we find we have a 1 to 2 year attention span for a problem, and then we want to move on to the next one. And it makes sense, right? Because we are dealing with the lives of children, and we never want to sacrifice any child who is in our care. We don't. So it makes sense. We're working with that tension. But as educators, we have to become, I think, more focused and more committed to saying, this is going to be a multi-year journey, because we are fixing generational damage. You can't fix generational damage in 1 to 2 years. And so how are we going to stay lightning focused on this for at least 10 years? Because that might be what it takes to completely overhaul the cultural water of our system. I think also education, we tend to be allergic to innovation. We tend to be allergic to really putting money into our schools because we want a return on investment like this, versus like, we will give lots of money to healthcare R&D, we'll give tons of money to tech, but like, we need to, as a society, have that same appetite and hunger for improving our schools. And I think, unfortunately, when you look at the landscape, we see so many funders now beginning to say, I'm going to pull back on education. Like, I'm going to disinvest from our future. And that is really scary. And I think that is a huge hurdle that a lot of our school systems are facing.
I'm going to start reading some of these great questions in the chat and make sure we are able to address some of our audience's interest. Keep populating the chat with your questions. This is a great time to do it. What are important components of the school day schedule that optimize efficient execution of science of reading? Is there a practice is there best practice and how often and how teachers are most in the most effective schools also looking? So 2 questions there. The school schedule, how do we optimize time? And then the second question, more on data and assessments. Nicole?
So, yeah. So when we started this journey, this was everyone, not just the English language arts literacy folks. Mathematics, science, social studies, social emotional learning. We brought everyone in because everyone was going to understand the research and the evidence. And then all of the teaching would be built on that evidence. So while you're in your reading block, yes, you're getting explicit systematic instruction, but in math, what we did was we aligned all of our content areas across the entire day and across the quarters and the semesters throughout the year. So we were building vocabulary, comprehension that was aligned to what they were doing in reading. We used science and social studies texts in the reading block for learning and practicing skills. Mathematics did the same thing. They had to align, even though we're teaching fractions, you're going to then write a story that had to work fractions into whatever it was, and then use these components that you've already been taught in the reading block. So there was a constant overlap. No one was exempt. Everyone had a role and a part in this, and they knew what that was. It took 3 years for people to realize why everyone was under one umbrella. And then it took another 3 years to come full circle and say, we finally did it. We've got it. They understand it. It makes sense and it's working and we're seeing the results. So not that we were at 80%. I always said I wanted to see 80% before I retired. Um, I left 5 years before I was going to retire from the system, but now I get to do that work across the entire nation. But it's helping everyone understand that they have a role. Parents have a role. We built out a companion course that's outward facing. The whole world can access it, calling Supporting Young Learners, and it goes through every single content area, telling parents and the community what they can be doing to help their child build those underlying language skills. It starts in we had infant toddlers, so we have content for those, and then we have pre-K, and then we have it banded K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it goes through all of the content areas and really builds out what parents can do, what children should know and be able to do by the end of that grade level, and then how they can support the instruction that's actually happening in their classrooms. And that really helped parents at home better understand and start asking questions like, why is my child doing 4 different programs on the computer when I can sit and work with them for 15 minutes and this is what they're able to then do? So really arming our parents and our teachers with all of that information, but no one's exempt. Everyone's a part of the solution and the process.
Nikki, on the question of is there best practice, how often teachers and the most effective schools are looking at data? Is there any kind of sense of how frequent that is or should be to know where kids are?
I think at the very least, you should look at the curriculum embedded assessments that are scheduled in your curriculum. So, for example, if you were using differentiated instruction by doctors Walpole and McKenna, which is another resource, it's about $30. You can buy it on Amazon. Every 15 lessons, there's going to be an assessment that assesses everything, every skill that was taught. And we should all look at that data every 15 days to see, is what I taught translating to each child who was in this module? What am I doing so that every single child passes within 15 lessons. If there are if there's children who do not pass, then they go back through that module. But I need to think about what are the specific skills that they struggled with, and how can I adjust my instruction to ensure that within the next 15 days, 100% pass this module and can move to the next one. So at the very least, you're following the curriculum embedded assessments. I think you're being really strategic and noticing like how do skills build and rigor across these series of lessons. What should I have my eyes on? Who do I notice is beginning to excel, who might be struggling a little bit, and I need to make sure that I direct these certain sounds, these certain skills to those students so they can get the right dose that they need. So that's the very least. And I think what we see at Lit often is that a lot of schools are looking at perhaps benchmark data. You know, we're looking at dibbles every round. That's what we're that's, you know, three months. So you're looking at stale data. And that's just like a dipstick, a temperature check to see how we're doing, versus every 15 lessons, every 20 lessons, we're looking at data. The name of the book that I mentioned is called Differentiated Instruction. It's by Dr. Sharon Walpole and Dr. Michael McKenna. Dr. Sharon Walpole is at the University of Delaware, and she's a fantastic reading researcher, implementer, and she has designed a phonics curriculum that is really simple, very direct, very straightforward. I've had friends who have used it with their children who now can decode and are on their way to being, you know, high-level readers. And so I think it's a really exquisite, elegant curriculum that others could check out.
We have another question. How do we overcome schools pushing for tutoring when it's a curriculum issue in the Tier 1 instruction? I think there's a ton of effort right now around high dosage tutoring, which is not to say it's not helpful for some kids, but how do we overcome this push when it's really a curriculum problem in Tier 1 instruction? Nicole?
So the tutoring must align to what is happening in the classroom. It shouldn't be disconnected and following a different scope and sequence. So if high dosage tutoring is going to be effective, there needs to be communication between that tutor and that teacher to know what is being taught, where the child's having difficulty, and how that tutor can provide the additional support in terms of intensity, frequency, and time. We do understand that in many cases, we do have a Tier 1 problem. It is high quality Tier 1 instruction where kids are really struggling. They don't have a disability. They're not going to qualify for an eligibility. We have to get better at Tier 1, high quality Tier 1 instruction. But when you introduce the tutoring piece, it has to align. The tutor cannot be working on blending when the teacher's working on segmenting. They have to also know the proper scope and sequence that sounds and that phonemic awareness develops along that continuum. Because if the teacher's teaching at one point on the continuum and that child has a gap, that tutor needs to know to go back to close that gap and provide that just-in-time instruction and accelerate that learning. Or all we're doing is moving that gap every year. We need to close that gap, provide just-in-time instruction, accelerate that learning, get them on grade level, and then continue reinforcing and moving them forward.
Nikki, you're smiling. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, I endorse everything Dr. Mancini has said. Because it's all facts. And I'm going to make a few assumptions because there might be an opportunity. So I'm going to assume that perhaps the high dosage tutoring that's being introduced is one that perhaps is trying to fill a gap in the reading rope. I'm going to assume it's word recognition. I'm going to assume if the school has a Tier 1 curriculum issue, maybe part of the issue is that the school doesn't yet have a strong phonics program. I'm making a lot of assumptions. If that is the case, if the tutoring is starting to show progress, it could be the leverage one needs to say, hey, instead of spending this money on tutoring, what if we adopted it? Is there something like we teachers are looking at this and saying, we can do this too? Could we do this? How about we bring it into our school to solve our tier 1 curriculum problem? Knowing that, again, there is no such thing as a fail-safe curriculum. There's none. You have to know your context, you have to know your kids, you have to know your data. But like, could we bring this in-house versus outsourcing it? Invest that money in us versus investing that money in an additional program. There could be something there. And also everything that Dr. Mancini said is also facts.
We had a question earlier about what about students that are dyslexic? What do we do to help them? I know that's I have a dyslexic son, so I know that's not an easy answer, but can you share a few thoughts on, do we need different things, more things for our dyslexic students? How do we help support them?
We need to be doing the right thing from the get-go, going right back to tier 1 instruction. If we provided systematic, explicit instruction, we know the percentage of students that benefit from that. Include that population of students that are identified as having dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia. So why are we not doing that as part of tier 1? That's my question. We need to be doing that. If we change tier 1 to address all of that, then you're going to see those kids become successful like their peers. They may struggle. It may take a little longer, but we have to be doing the right instruction first and foremost. And if we're using materials that haven't been designed based on the evidence and the research, and assessment that's not based on the evidence and the research, then we're doing a disservice not just to children with dyslexia, but to all children in those classrooms, which is one of the reasons why when we began to make these shifts, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of money spent on materials that were not aligned. And like Nikki referenced, it's, well, what is the return on investment? 10 years you spent money on all of this, and the numbers of students that are struggling is either at the same level or is plateauing, or it's dipping. It'll rise for a little bit, but then it plateaus again. We can tell when a school does really well and those numbers jump. 3 years, they're right back to where they were because they're doing quick fixes. They're not addressing the initial problem, which is very strong, high quality tier 1 instruction, explicit, systematic instruction, focused, strategic at the very beginning on helping kids acquire those necessary phonics, phonemic awareness skills, simultaneously weaving in the vocabulary, the content knowledge, and the background knowledge. They're two different things. A lot of people don't understand that. And then becoming fluent and then proficient readers. So they may need additional scaffolding and supports, but that type of approach, which you see in Orton Gillingham or in some of the other named programs with similar strategies, that is what they're doing. And if we can do that, we could gain a lot of progress, even with our students that have characteristics of dyslexia. But also recognizing what those characteristics are and addressing them early on. We can do that in very early in kindergarten and first grade. There's no reason why kids should be entering third grade and we're still wondering what's going on and why hasn't anyone done anything.
We are at time. I know we have more questions, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time who's been able to join us. We will send out some follow-up materials that were mentioned here, or links or names. And we will also ask you for a few bits of feedback so we can continue to host these webinars each month, and also other topics that you would be interested in. A huge thank you to you both. And for, most importantly, all the incredible work you're doing across the country to help so many of our schools and our teachers make the shifts they need, and our systems, most importantly, so that we can see a better future for our children. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here.